Today's daf is daf Peites. And we're going to begin with Ein Lo Ksuva, which is approximately 7 lines down from the top. The Mishnah says that when she heard testimony that her husband died and she got remarried, and then her husband comes alive, Ein Lo Ksuva. So the Gemara clarifies, why is it that they impose this penalty on her and she loses her ksuba? My timer tekinu lo rabbanan ksuba, kidei shelo tehei kala b'einav lo tzia, v'ha tehei kala b'einav lo tzia. In this case, where there's an illegitimate marriage, because her husband is still alive, there the Chachamim want to encourage the termination of that marriage, and they want him to divorce her. So therefore, they're not going to protect the marriage by adding the ksuba, and she therefore is subject to a penalty, and she loses her ksuba. And now we begin with Ein Lo Peros, which is 10 lines down from the top on Daf Peites Amud Aleph. The Mishnah teaches us that if the second husband ate peros, which really had no right to do because there was no marriage to the second husband, but yet he was innocent, he thought that there was a ksuba, the marriage was valid, these were nichsei malug, he has rights to eat the peros, he went ahead and he consumed the peros, she will not be able to collect compensation for the peros that he ate, even though, again, there was no marriage, there was no ksuba, and he had no right to eat the peros. And this is all part of the knas that they imposed on her, because, again, she wasn't very careful and she got remarried, relying on the, shall we say, the partial but not complete testimony in the case of Eidecha. V'lo mazonos, the Mishnah says that neither the first husband, original husband, nor the second is obligated in mazonos, and if she, out of desperation, would borrow money in order to support herself, the husband does not have to pay up those loans, belos. And if she brought clothing into the marriage, when she brought them in, they were in very good shape. Now they're called belos, they're called balu v'nishchaku. Nevertheless, although generally speaking, within the framework of marriage, a woman has a right at the termination of the marriage to force the husband to return those blows. In this case, she cannot do so. She's subject to this penalty, and she loses her rights to blows. And now the Gemara explains all the above with one principle. Tanai ksuba kiksuba dami. All those obligations that we listed earlier, which means the monomasayim, which means the peros and the mizonos and the blows, they're all part of Tanai ksuba. And since she has forfeited her rights of ksuba, therefore he doesn't have to pay any of the above. The Mishnah says, Nitola, if the woman took her ksuba and she wants to collect her ksuba, now that the marriages are coming to a termination, she wants to collect peros, etc., etc. The Mishnah says, mizeh umizeh. If, let's say, within the context of ksuba, she collected certain peros and so forth, and the Rabbanan imposed the penalty on her, and she forfeited those rights, then she has to repay for that which she took. Nitola, she took from the ksuba, she took peros, or any of the other monetary benefits like mizonos that she has within the framework of the ksuba, and she basically took that money, and now the Mishnah says she has to reimburse the husband, whether it's the first or the second, for that which she took. So the Gemara asks, Pshita, after all, once the Rabbanan, as we saw earlier in the Mishnah, have imposed this penalty on her, and she forfeits her ksuba, then certainly any monies that she took from the ksuba, and these were rights that she had based on the ksuba, those monies have to be returned to their proper owner. So the Gemara answers, Mao de Tema, I would have thought, Kevan de Tfasa, there's something called Tfisa. Tfisa means when you have money that's in a suffix situation, if somebody grabs that money, we can't force him to cough it up and return it. So she grabbed whatever monies of Haksuba, the payros, etc., the zonos. I would have thought, lo mafkina mine, we don't have the right to extract that money from her. Kamash Malon, therefore the Mishnah has to tell me that even though her situation is that of a tfisa, she's already grabbed these monies, nevertheless, we will remove these monies from her possession and she will have to replace those monies. The Aruch Laner, who, by the way, lived approximately 2 centuries ago in Germany, he was bothered by the Makshan and the Tarzan. I mean, didn't the Makshan realize that that she was a toe-face, but yet the Makshan thought that there was still pshita, that even though she grabbed it, she doesn't have rights to it. It's not like a case of safek, and therefore for sure she would have to pay those monies back. So what was exactly the shakl v'tarya here between the Makshan and the Tarzan? And the Aruch Haner says that the Makshan was medayek in the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah used the word tachzar. The word tachzar is not the same as motziin mimena or motziin miyada. Tachzar seems to imply that Bezdin will encourage her to pay back what she has taken. But it doesn't say motziin mimenu bal karcha. And therefore the Makshan, based on that understanding of the Mishnah, asked, well, if there's a takanas chachamim that she has a knas, then it's more than just that Bezdin should encourage her to pay back these monies, but rather Bezdin should really force her to pay back these monies. And the Tartan adds the following, that when the Tana uses the word tachzar, it means that even though it's already tafus etzla, even though she's already grabbed it, tachzar means that Bezdin is going to force her to pay it back. Mishnah says that when the husband comes back alive, then the child that she would have from the husband after he is returned, as well as any children she had from the second husband, they all have the status of a mamzer. And this, in the case of the first husband, is going to be almost like opening up a can of worms. What do I mean? In the case of the first husband, there's no mamzerus on a doraisa level. This is all a takanas chachamim, which means the chachamim are going to establish that the child that she has with the first husband, after he comes back, that child is a mamzer midirabanan, which means that the rabbanan are going to allow him to marry a mamzeres. And that brings up the old question of ha'im yesh koach biyad chachamim lakar dovim min haTorah. When the rabbanan want to institute some sort of a siag or a gzeira or a takana, do they have the right? Is it within the purview of their authority to undermine a Dvar Torah? So that this issue with regard to mamzer is going to come up at the very end of the sugya. The Gemara now is going to embark upon an entire study and an analysis and investigation of this question: how far is the power of the Chachamim? And we're going to apply it to various cases and beat him, and then we'll come swing back forward, full swing to our Mishnah with regard to mamzeres. Tanan Hosan, we learned in the Mishnah in Trumos, ein tor miminatome al hator. V'im toram b'shogeg truma, so truma b'mezid lo asa v'lo klum. So the Mishnah is talking about a case in which he's mafresh peiros tmeim in order to pater up peiros tahorib and remove their status of tevel. However, the Rabbanan did not allow this kind of a hafrasha because once the hafrasha will be chal, then the truma will be truma tmeya. Now, truma tmeya cannot be eaten. At best, the Kohen, when he receives truma tmeya, he can burn it as fuel, but he cannot eat it. So the question is, how far did the Rabbanan go with this prohibition of Ein Tarbim and Atame Alatar? The man went ahead and he was Mafresh Men Atame Alatar. And the Mishnah makes the following distinction. If he was unaware of the problem of Minatam Tame Alatar, that's called Shogeg. Or alternatively, he didn't realize that these payrolls that he was being Mafresh were Tmeim, then B'di'evet Rabbanan are not going to remove the status of the Truma, and therefore Truma so Truma. Everything is fine. But if he was mazed and he knew very well, A, that you're not allowed to be Mafresh Tamim Minatar, and B, that these payrolls that he's being Mafresh are Tmeim, then Chachamim declared lo asav lo klum. Now we're going to have a machlokas tanoim, amoraim, as to what the Mishnah means when it says lo asav lo klum. We're going to have the opinions of Rav Chizda and Rabbi Nosson. So we start with Rav Chizda. My lo asav lo klum, Amar Rav Chizda lo asav lo klum kol ikar. We're going to take this Mishnah literally at face value. The entire afrosha, the whole enterprise of a afrosha tame al hatar in a case of bezin is that filu ahi gvira hada litivle. Even that truma that he was mafresh, which on a deraisa level is truma, goes back to its state of tevel. It does not have a shame truma, and how much more so the peros tahorim that he was mafresh upon them, they remain tevel. Rav Nasan, Rav Oshamar, lo asav lo klum l'sakedes hashirayim avol truma havi. What the Mishnah means, lo asav lo klum, is that it is not effective to remove the shame tevel from the tahorim on which he was mafresh, but rather the hafrasha generates a shame truma on the peros tmeim that he was mafresh. And the lo asav lo klum is only vis-a-vis the peiros tahorim, which he was trying to remove the shem tevel. He cannot remove the shem tevel. So it comes out that according to Rav Nasan, he's going to have to be mafresh twice. Once is afresh with the shem tevel, the shem truma on the tmeim, and now he has to again be mafresh, but this time get it right and be mafresh from a tar onto the tame, for the tar onto the tar. And now he's going to be removing the shem tevel from the tar upon which he was mafresh. The Gemara now analyzes the question: why is it that Rav Chizda refused the interpretation of Rabbi Nosson? Rav Chizda, Rav Nosson, Rav Oshia, he's not willing to say that we should recognize the shem truma on the tummy that he was mafresh. The Amrin Ivy truma. What's going to be the interpretation in the mind of the mafresh when he hears that his hafrasha generated a shame truma, and he has to treat his peiros tmeim that he used for hafrasha as truma? Sitting in the pasha, below mafresh, he's going to think to himself that the very fact that you recognize the validity of the hafrasha, at least vis-a-vis the peiros tmeim that he was mafresh on, he gave it a shame truma. He's going to think that that hafrasha was effective, and therefore he has no need for a substitute and a replacement hafrasha, and let bygones be bygones. And that's called zimnin de pasha v'lo mafresh. He's going to be somech on the fact that there is a chalot shem truma on the peiros tmeim, and he's not going to listen to us and say, well, I have to be mafresh a second time for the peiros tahor. And therefore, according to Rav Chizda, lo omar v'lo asav v'lo klum means literally that even afrasha is not chal. So the Gemara asks a kash on Rav Chizda, Maishna, are you really convinced that the Rabbanan could not validate a afrasha because of those repercussions that he'll think that he doesn't have to be mafresh a second time? Maishna b'amisnan, what is different from the Mishnah? HaTorem, a man was mafresh b'shogeg, kishos. Now, again, as we said earlier, when you're mafresh truma for the Kohen, you want to give him something that's roy lachila. If it's tamei, we said it's not roy lachila. Here he was mafresh kishos, and these kishos were not roy lachila, right? They were very bitter. Nimteis mara. So when he's trying to be mafresh kishus that are mora onto kishus that are roy lachila. Another case, avatiach, right? Let's say a melon of some sort, and nimtei saruach. It turns out that the melon was spoiled, and it's not roy lachila. Truma v'yachzor v'yitro. That which he was mafresh is valid, and the same truma is chal. And yet he has to be mafresh a second time, finding something that's roy lachila. So we have a head-on collision with Rav Chisda, who says that if you're going to be machshir the truma and you're going to validate the same truma, then it'll come to be posher. He won't be mafresh on the payros. Gemara says shogeg amazid karamis. You're asking a kasha from the Mishnah in a case of shogeg on Rav Chisda, who's talking about a case of mazid. Shogeg lo avedi surah. In the case of shogeg, he didn't realize that these payros were sruchim and they were enam re'uyim, they were mora. He was a pure shogeg, and therefore we won't be choshesh that he'll justify in his mind that he doesn't have to be mafresh a second time. We can rely on him. He's a good guy. But mazid, in the case where a person realized that his payros were tmeim and that he's not allowed to be mafresh from them, and he went ahead, nevertheless, deliberately, and he was mafresh, such a person is chashud that he's not going to be mafresh a second time at all. He was mafresh once, and you recognize the truma, he'll be posher. So the Gemara asks for Rami shogeg shogeg. I'm going to ask you a kasha from shogeg shogeg. You won't be able to give me this thing to this answer. Hachatani. It says in the Mishnah if he was korein b'shogeg, truma, so truma. And we're talking about a case where he was mafresh tameh alatar, but he didn't realize that it was tameh, or he didn't know that you can't be mafresh tameh. And the Mishnah paskins truma, so truma. He doesn't have to be mafresh a second time. But hasam, there in the case of kishos v'nimtzis mora, avatiach v'sirachon tani. It says in the Mishnah that truma v'yachzor v'truma v'yitrom. So you see that with regard to shogeg, when he gives the kohen something that's not roy lachila, we're going to require him to replace it with a second afrasha. And yet, in the case of Tami alatar, we said in the Mishnah that if he was a shogeg, he doesn't have to replace the afrasha. Now, I don't think this kasha is necessarily a kasha on Rav Chisda. I think this is already a what we call an internal kasha, meaning we have to understand and reconcile these seeming contradictions about the status of shogeg. Are we going to recognize this afrasha or not? So the Gemara answers, Hasav, in the case of Torim Kishos, he's not a total shogeg. You know, let's admit that he could have tasted it before he was mafresh. It was chulin. So he had these kishos. He's now going to give the kohen something that might turn out to be mora. Why didn't you taste it beforehand? So that's called shogeg karv l'meisid. He should have tasted it. And therefore, we're going to tell him he has to replace it with another hafrasha. Replace it with something that's not mora, with something that's tasty and is edible for the kohen. You're not going to play games over here and tell me, oh, I didn't know it was mora. Well, before you give it to the kohen, before you mafresh it as truma, you should check it out. But in the case of Tami alatar, he couldn't have possibly known that these were tmeim. There's no way of tasting it and figuring out, are these tmeim? So we can't say to him, well, before you mafresh it, make sure, check it out, put a thermometer here and examine to make sure it's not tummy. He has no way of clarifying with this tummy. So later on, he finds that there was a sheretz that fell into a basket and so forth and so on. And therefore, they're not going to be goes there and require a second hafrasha to replace the first. But Rami mezid amazid, hach in the case of Torem, Tami alatar b'mezid, Ktani b'mezid lo klum, and Hasam Tanan there in the case of a Mishnah which we're going to study now about what's called Atzis Shenu Nakuv. There the Mishnah is going to say that if he was amazing, then his truma is truma, and v'yachzor v'yitrom, and that's against Rav Chisda, who says that that we're afraid that if his truma is truma, he's not going to be mafresh the second time around. Here's a case where it's amazing, and we're going to allow his hafrasha to be recognized as valid, yet require of him to replace hafrasha. What's the case? So for this, we have to know the following: that the mitzvah of truma and the Isser of tevel is only chal on tolush. And not only that, it's only chal on something which is completely removed from the karka. So we have two kinds of flower pots, if you will. We have nakuv, which is perforated, and we have eno nakuv, which is a complete separation from the ground. Anything that's growing in an otzitz chain and nakuv is not growing in the ground, it's growing in the otzitz. Now the Torah requires truma from that which is growing in the ground. So he went ahead, b'mezid, and he was torem from an otzitz she'eno nakuv, meaning it's not perforated, it's solid on the bottom, it's not nurturing from the nutrients of the karka, therefore it's not connected to the karka at all, and therefore it's not chayiv in Jeruas of Maisros, al nakuv, and he wants to be mafresh on another otzitz, which is next door, and that otzitz is an otzitz nakuv, where we consider it as if it's growing from the ground, so it's chayiv in Jeruas of Maisros min Torah. And he was amazing, and the law is truma v'yachsav v'yitrom against Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says you cannot have your cake and eat it too. You can't say truma and then say yachsav v'yitrom because he'll be posher. So the Gemara answers: betray money tzayis, bechad money lo tzayis. When it's a case of two different kalim, there's an otzitz nakuv and an otzitz she'enu nakuv, and we're going to tell him that vis-a-vis the otzitz nakuv, he's got to replace that hafrasha because that hafrasha wasn't chal on the otzitz nakuv, is tzayis. He will definitely listen and obey the law. He'll agree to be mafresh a second time around. He won't be posher. But in the case of Torah minat tamei alatar, there all the peros grew bechad man in one kli. So if we're going to tell him that on the peros in the kli as hafrasha was chal to generate a shem truma, then lo tzais, he's not going to listen to you and obey the law that he's required to be mafresh a second time. Now the Gemara asks, Ula Rav Nasan Rav Ochia, who rejected Rav Chisda the Yomi, and he holds lo asav lo klum l'sakin shirayim avol truma havi.